I want to start with what I knew about Hareth before he was brought to me. Nothing, I knew nothing. That was the whole of it. I knew about the war on the Dorne Flats. Everyone who worked the frontier knew about that, the low percussion of it in the ground on bad nights, the supply convoys that came through Keth Sor with their headlights dim and their cargo under tarps, the way the sky sometimes went the wrong color toward the eastern ridge, colors that had no names in any language I grew up speaking. You worked out here long enough, and you stopped asking what was happening and started asking only what was in front of you. A wound, a fever, a broken rib, the thing in front of you, that was all any of us had. The Dorne Flats themselves were not beautiful in any way that a person visiting for a day or a week would recognize. They were flat and pale and enormous, stretching east from the way station ridge to a horizon that looked the same at noon as it did at dawn, a clean, hard line between the dust-white ground and the enormous sky. In the dry season, the dust was fine enough to suspend in the air well above head height, and the light through it had a quality that was neither bright nor dim, but simply everywhere, sourceless, as if the air itself were faintly luminous. Nothing cast a clean shadow on the Dorne Flats. Nothing except, occasionally, the shapes that crossed the sky at high altitude, moving against the prevailing wind in ways that said they were not atmospheric. I had learned not to watch those for long. I had been the night shift nurse at Keth Sor Field Clinic for 11 years by then. The clinic itself had been a way station once, a rest point for caravans crossing the Dorne Flats before the flats became what they were. Somebody had converted it in a hurry about 15 years back, bolted a treatment bay onto the old stone way station building, added corrugated metal walls and 3 cot benches, and a supply closet, and a battered autoclave that worked 2/3 of the time. There were skylights cut into the corrugated roof, 4 of them, long and narrow, and during the day they let in a wash of flat white Dorne Flats light that was too bright for the kind of work we did, and not bright enough for reading. At night they showed stars when the sky was clear, which it wasn't often. The staff was thin. There was Dr. Pell, who drove in from Hareth Station, which is what everyone called the settlement 20 kilometers south. It had a different name on the maps, but nobody used it, and who covered daytime hours 3 days a week when there was anything worth covering. There was a med tech named Cuvari who did supply runs and handled the simpler dressings and had a gift for getting the autoclave running again when it quit. And there was me. My name is Adra Voss. I was 61 years old. I had worked in medicine for 38 of those years, most of it in places like Keth Sor, the places nobody applied for, the postings that cycled through young doctors doing their service rotations before they moved on to somewhere better. I was not young. I was not moving on. I had come to the Dorne Flats frontier 8 years after my husband died of something that should not have killed him, but did, in a clean hospital in a city with a good reputation, and I had decided somewhere in the fog of that year that if I was going to be around sickness, I was going to be around it honestly, at the edge of things, where the light was flat and the autoclave broke down, and the supply chains frayed, and the medicine you needed was frequently not the medicine you had. I was not trying to prove anything by being there. It was simply the right shape for the rest of my life, and I had known it the way you sometimes know a thing without being able to explain it. So, 11 years on the night shift. 2 in the morning was when I was sharpest, which tells you something about what I had become. They came in at 2:09 on a Tuesday in what the Dorne Flats calendar called the deep of the 3rd dry season, which meant the dust outside was the consistency of fine flour, and the temperature at night was still 40 degrees, and the stars when visible were extraordinary. I heard them before I saw them, a low-frequency sound, not quite a vibration, more like a change in the pressure of the air, the way a storm feels before it shows itself. I was at the supply counter doing a recount of the wound irrigation packs because the last shipment had come up for short, and I wanted to know whether it was a counting error before I filed the complaint. I stopped counting. The sound grew, then the door came open. There were 6 of them in the entry corridor, 6 dragons, each one somewhere between 2 and 3 meters tall at the shoulder, which meant they filled the corridor the way water fills a pipe, edge to edge, taking up every available space. They were armored in a way that wasn't quite armor, overlapping plates of something dark and dense-looking that had been worked into harnesses rather than full suits, leaving the natural scales of neck and flank exposed. Their scales were deep gunmetal, ridged along the spine, each ridge edge showing a dull burnish like old steel. Their heads were long and angular, jaw-heavy, with a secondary brow ridge that cast the eyes in deep shadow. The eyes themselves were amber, pale amber, and they caught the clinic's overhead lights and threw them back with a flat, even quality that I recognized from working with animals. The reflective layer, the tapetum, that sits behind the retina. The kind of eyes that see better in the dark than you do. None of the 6 of them were hurt. That was the first thing I clocked. The second thing was what they were carrying. He was on a kind of stretcher, 4 poles and a flat panel of some material I didn't recognize, dark and slightly flexible, held at shoulder height by 4 of the 6. He was vast. Even horizontal he was vast. I estimated later that he ran 4.5 meters from nose to the base of his tail, and he was deep-chested, wide-shouldered in the way of something that had spent its life in the air, with a wingspan that would have cleared 9 meters when open. The wings were folded now, and one of them was wrong. The left wing was folded the right way, but the joint was wrong, the angle of it off by about 30 degrees in a way that meant either severe dislocation or fracture or both. The color of his scales was unlike the escort's. Where they were gunmetal, he was a deep bronze red, the color of old copper lit from inside, each scale edged in a darker line so that his whole body had a tiled quality, like something built rather than grown. His eyes were closed. His breathing was audible from the doorway, wet and effortful, with a catch at the top of each inhale that I knew the sound of. It was the sound of fluid in a space it shouldn't be in. One of the 6, the one at the front, who had not been carrying the stretcher and whose harness had different markings, more of them, denser, spoke. The translation unit on my wrist rendered it after a pause of about 3 seconds, which was longer than usual and told me something about the complexity of what was being said, or the dialect. You are the medical authority of this station. It wasn't a question. I told him I was the night nurse. Dr. Pell would be available in 6 hours. The pause before the translation came back to me was even longer that time. Then, we do not have 6 hours. I looked at the dragon on the stretcher. I looked at the wet catch in his breathing and the angle of the wing joint, and the dark staining on his scales along the left flank that told me the lacerations there had been treated but not properly, and were weeping again through whatever field dressing had been applied. I looked at all of that, and then I looked back at the one with the denser markings. "Bring him through," I said. The treatment bay was not built for something his size. That was simply true. The cot benches were each about 2 meters long, set at a standard height for a humanoid patient, and they were not relevant here. What I had was floor space. The treatment bay was 8 meters by 6, which was not generous but was not nothing either. I told them to put him down in the center of the floor, the long axis of his body aligned with the long axis of the room, and to give me space to work around him. The 4 who had been carrying moved back toward the wall. The stretcher was left underneath him, and I didn't fight that. Moving him again would cost something, and he didn't have a lot to spend. The one with the dense marking stayed at the doorway to the bay. The other 5 arranged themselves in the corridor behind him. They did not leave. I had not expected them to. I got my kit and I crouched down beside him, and I started from the head and worked toward the tail the way I always did with any patient, any species, because the systematic approach was the thing that kept you from missing the thing that killed them. His temperature was the first shock. I had treated 3 dragons in 11 years at Keth Sor, a hatchling with a broken foot brought in by a terrified farm worker, a juvenile with a gut infection that was almost too far gone when they arrived, and a middle-aged female with a badly healed old fracture that had finally given way. None of them had been this size. None of them had prepared me for the heat of him. When I put my hand on the side of his neck to find the pulse, the scale was hot enough that I had to concentrate to keep my hand in place, not burning, but close, the way a stone wall feels in the middle of the afternoon when it has been in the sun all day. The pulse was there, fast and weak and irregular in the way that said his heart was working very hard to maintain a pressure it was not sure it could maintain. I kept my hand there until I had a count, then I moved on. The lacerations on the left flank were as bad as the staining had suggested, 4 of them, running in rough parallel, the longest about 40 centimeters, all of them reaching through scale into the tissue beneath. The field dressing had been clean work, but it was 3 layers of packing and pressure bandage over wounds that needed to be irrigated and closed properly, and whatever had been used to stop the bleeding was starting to lose the argument. I noted the sight and moved on, because the first priority was the breathing. The wet catch on the inhale was fluid accumulation in the left pleural space. I was fairly sure of that without imaging, which I didn't have for a patient this size. The clinic's portable scanner was calibrated for humanoid anatomy, and while it would give me something, it would not give me enough. I had a good stethoscope in 38 years, and I trusted both. I listened to his chest for a long time. The fluid was there. The question was how much and whether it was accumulating fast enough to need draining before I addressed anything else, or whether it was stable enough that I could work the flank wounds first and come back to it. He shifted while I was listening. Not much. A slow tensing of the muscles along his side, the way a sleeping animal tenses when it becomes aware of contact. His eyes didn't open, but the quality of his breathing changed. The wetness was the same, but the rhythm altered, sped slightly, a consciousness returning to something. I kept the stethoscope where it was. I kept my voice level and low. "Easy," I said. "You're in a clinic. You're on the floor because the furniture doesn't fit you. I'm the nurse. I'm going to look after you, and I need you to stay still if you can." I don't know if he understood me. The translation unit would have rendered it into his language. It was working. I could see the light on my wrist, but whether it was good dialect, whether it captured tone, I couldn't know. What I knew was that the tensing in his muscles slowly released. Not completely, but enough. The one with the dense markings had moved a step into the treatment bay. I did not look up from my patient. "He understands," the translation unit said after a delay. The one with the markings had spoken, not Harath. I filed that away and kept working. The wing joint was the thing I was least qualified to address, and the thing that concerned me most after the fluid and the flank. A fracture at that joint in a creature with this wingspan was not simply orthopedic. The joint was where enormous mechanical forces concentrated during flight, and if it had been broken under load, it had been broken catastrophically. The shape of the bones through the scale told me there was both fracture and dislocation, the joint driven out of its socket by a force that had also snapped the primary strut. I could stabilize it. I could not repair it. That would require a specialist and equipment I didn't have. What I could do was get it into a position that wasn't making things worse, and splint it there, and make sure he couldn't move it while he was unaware enough to try. I worked for the first hour without speaking much. I cleaned and properly irrigated the flank lacerations. That took time, because thorough irrigation was the only thing that stood between those wounds and the kind of infection that would kill him inside a week regardless of anything else. I used all 4 of my remaining wound irrigation packs and made a note to document the shortage. I sutured the 2 longest lacerations with the heaviest gauge I had, which was lighter than I would have liked for tissue this dense, so I doubled up and took extra bites. The shorter 2 I dressed and pressure bandaged. His temperature while I worked stayed constant, high, but not climbing, which was something. He made sounds sometimes. Not words, or nothing that the translation unit rendered as words, low sounds, the kind that sit below language that seem to come from the chest before the mind has decided on them. Pain sounds, effort sounds, the sound of a body trying to manage something it hadn't chosen. I kept talking when he made them. Not much and not loud, just a running account of what I was doing and why, the way I had learned to talk to patients who were too far under to respond, but whose nervous systems were still taking it in. You are going through the large one first because it needs the most stitches. The smaller ones are actually cleaner than they looked from the outside. You have lost a significant amount of blood, but your pressure is holding. I am going to move to the wing in a few minutes. I am going to need you to keep very still for that part. Whether any of it reached him the way it reached a human patient, I didn't know, but he kept still. Around the second hour, I heard a sound from the doorway and I glanced up. The one with the dense markings had sat down, settled rather, onto his haunches in the doorway, which brought his head to about half the height it had been at. He was watching me. The 5 in the corridor were still standing. I looked back at my patient. "What is your name?" the translation unit said. The one with the markings had spoken again. I told him without looking up, "Adra Voss, night nurse, Kethsor Field Clinic." Another delay. "Then you are not afraid?" I considered that for a moment while I tied off the last suture on the second laceration. "I'm concerned about the fluid in his chest," I said. "That's more pressing than being afraid." The longest delay yet. Then what might have been the sound of a short exhale from the doorway, not quite a laugh, not quite not. I moved to the wing joint. This was the part that required the most care and caused the most pain and demanded the most cooperation from a patient who was half conscious and not in a position to understand exactly what I needed from him. I explained it anyway. I told him what I was going to do, that I was going to try to bring the dislocated portion of the joint back toward its socket as much as I safely could without imaging to tell me exactly where the fracture lines ran, that I was going to splint it in the best position I could find, that it was going to hurt, that I needed him to tell me if it became too much. The wing itself was extraordinary, even folded, even damaged. The membrane between the supporting struts was not the leathery thing I might have imagined from the farmhand's hatchling or the juvenile, both of whom had been small enough that the wing was a manageable size. This was enormous, and the membrane was more complex, layered, I thought, several overlapping layers of different thickness, with a fine internal structure. I could see where the light caught it at an angle, each layer contributing something to the mechanical whole. It would not repair simply. Nothing in the architecture of it was built for simplicity. It was built for endurance and power, and the specific aerodynamic demands of something this size in whatever atmosphere it had evolved in. I did not know what I was looking at in detail. I knew what I was looking at in general, something that worked by principles I only partly understood, and something that deserved to be treated as carefully as anything I had ever put my hands on. He opened his eyes while I was talking. I had not expected it. The eyes had stayed closed through all of the flank work, through the sutures and the irrigation, through the first 2 hours. Now they opened. They were not amber like the escorts. They were a darker color, deeper, somewhere between amber and copper, the same register as his scales, and they were very large up close, far larger than the escorts, with a vertical pupil that was fully dilated in the clinic light and made the iris almost invisible. He looked at me for a moment. I looked back. "I understand," the translation unit said. His voice was different from the escort's, slower and deeper, and it had harmonics in it that the escort's voice didn't have, a quality like a sound made in a large space rather than a small one, as if the chest it came from was very deep. The translation unit was working hard. The light on my wrist was blinking at a rate I hadn't seen it blink before. Good dialect was probably not what it was producing, but I understand doesn't need much nuance. I worked the wing joint for 40 minutes. He stayed still. I will not say he didn't make sounds. He did. The low chest sounds again, more of them during the worst moments of the reduction, and once a sharper sound that I had never heard from him before, and that raised every instinct I had before the translation unit rendered it as something that meant, roughly, a deliberate steadying of breath, something closer to a controlled exhale than anything emotional. I kept talking. I told him exactly where my hands were and what they were doing. I told him when the worst moment was coming so he could brace for it. I told him when it was done. When I had the joint as settled as I could get it without a specialist, I built the splint from the materials I had: structural foam bandaging over a frame of the heaviest gauge wire in my supply kit. Not elegant, not permanent, but stable enough to hold through a transfer to a proper facility. I taped and overwrapped and checked the tension twice. By the end, his eyes had closed again. His breathing was still wet. I went to get the thoracentesis kit. Cuvari had organized the supply closet 6 months ago, and what she had done was exact and sensible, and meant I could find what I needed in the dark if required. The thoracentesis kit was on the 3rd shelf, 2nd bay. I had used it twice in 11 years, once on a human patient with a traumatic pneumothorax, and once on the juvenile dragon with the gut infection who had developed secondary complications. Both times it had worked. Both times I had been calm about it because the alternative to calm was not helping. I came back into the treatment bay with the kit and crouched beside him again, and began explaining what I was going to do and why. One of the 5 in the corridor made a sound, not a word, a sound. The one with the dense markings turned his head toward the corridor and made a different sound, brief and flat, and the corridor went quiet. "He cannot fly again regardless," the translation unit said after a pause. "The one with the markings again. Whatever you do here, that wing." "I know," I said. "The wing is a separate question. Right now his chest is filling up, and that's the question in front of me." Silence from the doorway. "Do what you need to do," the translation unit said. I did. The fluid was more than I had hoped for, and less than I had feared. I drained a little over a liter before the rhythm of the outflow changed, and told me I had reached the clean margin and should stop. His breathing changed while I was draining. The wet catch smoothed out, not completely but substantially, the effort in each inhale dropping to something his body could sustain without working quite so hard. I kept my hand on his side and felt the difference. He didn't open his eyes, but something in the tension of his body shifted. I dressed the drain site and taped it and sat back on my heels for a moment because my knees had been complaining for the last hour and I had been ignoring them. The clinic skylights were showing the first pale change from black to dark blue. Not dawn yet, close to it. I looked at him. 4.5 meters of bronze-red scale and damaged wing and sutured flank, breathing steadily now, the pulse on his neck better, still fast, still not what I'd want, but better. He was not out of difficulty. He was going to need a proper facility for the wing, for imaging, for blood work that I couldn't run here, for the kind of sustained care that a one-nurse frontier clinic couldn't provide. But he was not going to die in my treatment bay in the next 6 hours, which was what had been on the table when they brought him in. I sat there for a moment longer than I needed to. That was unusual for me. I was not a person who sat when there was still work to do, and there was still work to do. The notes, the inventory, the documentation of materials used. But I sat and I looked at him and I listened to him breathe. There is something about a breath that's working right that I have never found adequate language for. It is not dramatic. It is not visible. It is simply sound, the rhythm of it, the depth of it, the absence of effort. You spend enough time listening to breathing that isn't right, to the catches and the labors and the sounds of systems straining against themselves, and you develop an ear for the thing working correctly that is precise and immediate and nothing like what it sounds like to describe it. His breath was working right. That was all. That was everything. I went to the supply counter and made my notes. I wrote everything down: the presenting state, the interventions, the materials used, the times, the observations. I wrote about the pulse and the temperature and the fluid volume and the gauge of suture I had used and why. I wrote about the wing joint and the limitations of the splint and the need for specialist follow-up and imaging. I wrote carefully and completely because the notes were the record, and the record was the thing that would matter for whoever saw him next. The translation unit on my wrist was quiet. The treatment bay was quiet except for his breathing. I heard the corridor change. Not a sound exactly. More the absence of sounds that had been there, the faint movement sounds of the escort, the occasional shift of weight and scale, the low ambient noise of 6 large bodies in a confined space. Those sounds had been there for the entire night, low-level, present, the way background sounds become invisible until they stop. They stopped. I didn't look up immediately. I finished the sentence I was writing. Then I walked to the doorway of the treatment bay. The 5 in the corridor were on their knees. Not bent low in the way of pain or exhaustion. Their backs were upright, their heads lowered at the front of their neck, the angle of it specific and deliberate. Their hands, the forelimb ends, 3-clawed and broad, were flat on the floor before them. The harness plates on their backs caught the first early dawn light coming through the corridor window and held it. The one with the dense markings was still in the treatment bay doorway, still on his haunches as he had been for most of the night. He turned his head toward me when I appeared, and something in his face shifted, something around the eyes, the brow ridge, a change in the way the muscles of the jaw held themselves. "You did not ask what he is," the translation unit said. I looked at the 5 on the floor. I thought about the night, the slow, careful work of it, the talking to a patient who may or may not have heard me, the heat of him under my hands, the weight of the drainage kit, the way his breathing had changed when the fluid cleared. "He's my patient," I said. "That's what he is." A long pause, longer than any of the others. The pale amber eyes of the one with the markings held mine for a while, and I let them. "He is Harath," the translation unit said. "Velkan, first of that name in 4 generations, warlord king of the Koreth Reach and all the territories under the Bronze Standard." I took that in. He also has a pleural effusion that will need monitoring, and a wing fracture that needs a specialist and a follow-up bloodwork panel I can't run here, I said. "Write that down. That's what he needs next." The one with the markings looked at me for another moment. Then he made a sound that was not the flat, brief command sound he had used on the corridor earlier, and not the possible laugh of 2 hours ago. It was a sound I didn't have a category for, low and resonant, and held for a moment longer than it needed to be. The translation unit didn't render it. Maybe it wasn't a word. He stood, full height, which in the corridor was considerable, and then he lowered his head. Not to the floor the way the 5 did. A different angle, the chin toward the chest, the neck long, the brow ridge brought down. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then he straightened. "Velkan will send a care unit," the translation unit said. "They will arrive before the next full darkness." "Tell them to bring a bone specialist and a full imaging rig," I said. "The splint is temporary. It won't hold more than 48 hours. "It will be so." I went back inside. Harath was breathing. Steadily, evenly, the wet catch gone, the rhythm of it deep and slow now in the way of genuine sleep, rather than the near unconscious of someone fighting to stay alive. His eyes were closed. The bronze red of his scales in the early light coming through the skylights was remarkable. I noticed it now in a way I hadn't had time to notice through the night. The way each scale caught the light slightly differently from its neighbor. The way the darker edge lines created a depth to his coloring that flat description didn't capture. He looked old, which was not the same as looking weak. He looked like something that had been made over a very long time. I pulled the stool over from the supply counter and sat beside him and finished my notes. When Dr. Pell arrived at 7:30, she stood in the doorway of the treatment bay for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, that she was going to need coffee before she looked at anything. I told her where the pot was. She knew where the pot was. It was something to say. I briefed her on the night while she drank. The presenting state, the interventions, the current status, the follow-up requirements, the Velkan care unit arriving before nightfall. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and then she went and examined him herself. Her own systematic approach, her own stethoscope, her own hands, and when she was done she came back to where I was standing. "The pleural drainage was the right call," she said. "It was the only call. The sutures are better than they had any right to be at that gauge." I doubled up. She looked at me for a moment. Pell was 43, which was 12 years in the Dorn Flats frontier medicine, which was enough years that she had stopped being surprised by most things. She looked like she was being surprised by something now. "Did you know who he was?" she said. "I found out around dawn," I said, "after." She nodded slowly. Then she asked if I had slept, and I said I hadn't, and she told me to go do that. I told her to watch his temperature and his breathing and the drain site, and she told me she was a doctor and knew what to watch, and I went home. Home was a 2-room flat above the storage building, 20 meters from the clinic. I had lived there for 11 years. It was not large and it was not comfortable, and I had made it exactly what I needed it to be, which was a place to sleep and a place to sit, and a window that faced east over the Dorn Flats so that the mornings, when the flat light came in and the dust in the air caught it, and turned it gold for about 20 minutes before it went white again, were extraordinary. I sat by the window for those 20 minutes and watched the light change and thought about the night. I thought about the sound of his breathing when the fluid cleared. That specific change, the way the effort in it dropped, the way the rhythm settled from something fighting itself into something simply moving, the way the hand I kept on his side felt the shift happen. 38 years of medicine, and that moment, the moment the intervention works, the moment the body takes the help you've given it and starts using it, never got old, never became routine. It was always, every time, a specific thing, the body's own will to continue, made visible, and you had found the way to help it along. I thought about his eyes when he opened them. The copper amber of them, the size of them, the way they had focused on me in the clinic light. I had expected something, I am not sure what, the wariness of a wild animal perhaps, or the opacity of something too far gone to fully register where it was. What I had gotten was attention. A full, clear, present attention, the kind that said the mind behind the eyes was entirely there, was in pain and frightened and burning with fever, but there, present. Looking at me across whatever distance the difference between us made. I had told him what I was doing. He had listened. That seemed, in the early morning light of my flat above the Dorn Flats, like the whole of it. You tell a patient what you're doing and why. You keep your hands steady. You use everything you have. You make your notes. And then you do the next thing. I slept. When I came back to the clinic at 4 in the afternoon, the Velcon care unit was there. There were 12 of them, and they had brought equipment. A proper imaging rig on a hover pallet, a sealed medical supply rack, instruments I didn't have names for. 3 of them were wearing what was clearly a medical designation, differentiated from the others by a strip of pale color on the harness and a different configuration of whatever the tool array at their wrists was. One of them was examining my splint on Harath's wing with a close attention that I recognized. The attention of someone who is assessing someone else's work and working out whether to approve of it or not. He looked up when I came in. He was younger than the escort, if I could judge age in dragons with any accuracy, with a lighter scale color and a slightly different build, longer in the neck, less heavy in the jaw. The translation unit on my wrist rendered what he said after the usual pause. The splint is effective given available materials. The fracture site is stable. I thanked him and asked about the imaging results. He showed me. The imaging rig had already run its pass. I had been asleep for that, and the results were displayed on a flat panel he angled toward me. I could read bone density maps. I could read fracture lines. I could make sense of the anatomy even where it was unfamiliar, because the structural logic of bone is the structural logic of bone regardless of what it belongs to. The fracture was a spiral break of the primary strut at the joint, with secondary cracking along 2 of the attachment ridges. The dislocation was what I had estimated, within a few degrees. He will not fly on this wing again, the young medical officer said. I had known that since 2 in the morning. Does he know? The pause was longer than usual. He will be told. Tell him gently, I said. He's been asleep for most of the night and half the day. He'll hear things more clearly when he's less exhausted. Another pause, then. You speak as though you know him. I spent 8 hours with him, I said. That's enough to know some things. The young medical officer looked at me for a moment. Then he looked back at his panel. You are correct, he said after a long pause. He hears things more clearly when he is rested. You are, and here the translation unit labored for longer than usual, the light on my wrist blinking several times before it offered. Observant. It was not quite the word it had been reaching for, but it would do. Hareth woke around 6 in the evening. I was at the supply counter writing my follow-up notes when it happened, a change in the quality of his breathing, a shift in his weight against the floor, and then the slow opening of the copper-amber eyes. He turned his head toward the care unit activity, and then, after a moment, toward me. I walked over and crouched beside him. His temperature was down from the night, still elevated, but the fever-hot quality was gone, replaced by a warmth that felt metabolic rather than pathological. The pulse at his neck was better, more regular. His color looked right to me, whatever right meant for a bronze-red scale that I had only been studying for one night. How are you feeling? I said. The translation unit worked. Then slowly he replied, and the unit rendered it as better than I was. Yes, I said, that's true. He looked at me for a moment. His eyes moved over my face with the same full attention they had carried when he first opened them in the night, but slower now, less urgent. Something calmer in them. You talked to me, the translation unit said, during the night. I remember the sound of it. I talk to all my patients, I said. It helps them stay calm, helps me stay organized. What did you say? I told him I had narrated the work, the irrigation and the sutures and the chest drainage, what each thing was for and how it was going. He listened to this with his head slightly tilted, the brow ridge lowered in something that I read as concentration. Then he said, and the translation unit took a long time with it. You told me when it would hurt. Yes. So that I could prepare. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The care unit was still working around us, the bone specialist consulting with the younger medical officer, instruments being calibrated, the imaging rig running a second pass with different settings. None of them came close while Hareth and I were talking. I was aware of that without understanding it fully. Kethra, Hareth said. The translation unit rendered it as a title, healer of those who are brought in. A compound word that I understood after a moment's thought was the Velcon equivalent of what I was. Night nurse, I said. We call it night nurse. The amber eyes held mine for a moment longer. Then, Kethra, again, with a quality the translation unit didn't try to render. I stood up. My knees were no more pleased with me than they had been at 4 in the morning. You need to rest more. The care unit is going to want to run more assessments in the morning, and the bone specialist will talk to you about the wing. He didn't respond to that immediately. Then I know what the wing is. I know you know, I said. Get some sleep anyway. I went back to my notes. The care unit stayed through the night and into the next day. Dr. Pell and I worked around them. There were enough of them that the treatment bay was crowded, which was new for a space that was usually too quiet, and the supply closet got used heavily enough that Kuvari had to do an emergency reorder. We managed. Medicine at the edge of things has a flexibility that medicine in clean, well-funded facilities sometimes loses. You learn to work around constraints so thoroughly that working around new ones feels like ordinary practice. On the second morning, the one with the dense markings appeared at my flat. Not at the clinic, at my flat at the door at 6:30, which was before my shift started. I was already awake because the Dorn Flats mornings were the mornings they were, and I had not been sleeping entirely well in any case. I opened the door and looked up at him. He was armored still. The dark plates of the harness settled on him with the quality of something worn so long it had become a second skin. In the early flat light of outside, he looked different than he had in the corridor. The amber eyes were a warmer color in daylight, and the gunmetal scales had a faint iridescence to them that the overhead clinic light had not shown. "Hareth asks for you," the translation unit said. I asked if something was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," he asks. I got my kit bag and went with him. Hareth was awake and sitting up, or as close to sitting up as something his size and shape could manage, his forelegs braced, his chest elevated, his head raised. The wing was in its splint. The care unit was doing morning assessments at the far end of the bay. He turned his head toward me when I came in. "Adra Voss," the translation unit said. "Adra," I said. "Just Adra is fine." A pause, then, "Adra." He tried the sound of it without the translation unit, which meant I heard it in his own voice, the deep harmonics of it, a two-syllable weight that sounded like something said in a large stone room. I was not sure it sounded like my name. It sounded like something else that meant me, which is perhaps the same thing. "You will have questions," the translation unit said. "About your condition, yes. I'd like to know the imaging results." "About what I am." I considered that. "The escort told me your name and your title on the first morning," I said. "Velkan, Warlord King of the Koreth Reach." I wrote it in the notes because it seemed like relevant patient history. The amber eyes watched me, the brow ridge moved slightly, and the bloodwork from the care unit's second panel shows your electrolytes are improving, which is good news. And the fever is down to a point I'm comfortable with. And the drain site is clean, and I want to keep it that way. He was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his face around the eyes and the jaw muscles, and the translation unit, after a longer pause than usual, offered, "You are," and then produced a word that it flagged as approximate. "Steady." I had been called worse things. "Is that what you wanted to ask me?" I said. "Whether I had questions about your title?" "I wish to know," the translation unit said, and then paused and then continued, "whether you would have worked differently if you had known, in the night." I thought about that for a genuine moment. I thought about 2 in the morning, and the wet catch in his breathing and the heat of him under my hands, and the 40 minutes of careful work on the wing joint, and the thoracentesis kit, and the long hours of sutures, and talking to a patient who may or may not have been able to hear me. "No," I said. The amber eyes held mine. "You were hurt and you needed help," I said. "That's the whole of it. That's always the whole of it." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the skylights, the Dorn Flats morning was going from gold to white, the 20 minutes of extraordinary light burning through and becoming the flat, bright, ordinary day. "My people," the translation unit said slowly, with the careful quality of something being worked out in the language as well as translated, "believe that a Kethra who treats the dying without knowing they are dying is," and here a long pause, "more worth honoring than one who treats the known." I looked at him. "I wasn't treating you as dying," I said. "I was treating you as hurt. There's a difference." Another long pause. "Yes," the translation unit said, "there is." He told me then, or the translation unit rendered it, imperfectly, across what was clearly a significant linguistic distance. Something about the way the Velkan thought about healing and healers. It was not the same way I thought about it, and I don't want to flatten it by summarizing it too cleanly, because it had a complexity that the translation unit was clearly struggling with, and that I was therefore getting a partial version of. What I understood was something like this, that in the Velkan tradition, the nature of a healer was demonstrated not by training or credentials or equipment, but by what the healer did when they did not know who they were treating. When the patient was stripped of name and rank, and the healer had nothing to go on but the wound. There was more to it than that. There was something about the distinction between treating a body and treating a being, a distinction the Velcon apparently made formally in their medical traditions, and which the translation unit tried several times to render before settling on a word that meant roughly tending with full regard, as opposed to a word that meant tending as function. I thought about that for a while, about whether what I did was tending as function or tending with full regard, and whether I had always known the difference and simply not had language for it, or whether it was something I had arrived at gradually over 38 years without naming it. The answer was probably both. He also told me, and this part the translation unit was clearest on, that the escort had expected one of two things when they brought him in: that I would refuse because the injury was too severe and the patient too large and the clinic too limited, or that I would attempt something and fail. That neither of those had happened was, apparently, not nothing. I had been treating patients like that for 38 years. I had not known it was a philosophy. "I'm going to check the drain site now," I said when he was done, "and I want to look at the flank sutures." "Of course," the translation unit said. I worked. He was quiet and still while I worked, the way he had been on the first night, cooperative in the particular way of something that had made a decision about whether to cooperate and had made it clearly. I told him what I was doing, not because he needed me to, this morning. He was awake and coherent and could see my hands, but because it was how I worked, and it was honest, and it seemed like the right way to do things with a patient who valued the kind of attention it implied. The sutures were holding well. The drain site was clean. The fever was low enough that I was not worried. I stood up and washed my hands at the clinic's single sink and dried them on the clinic's single hand towel, which was not as clean as I would have liked because the laundry situation at Keth-Sor was one of the ongoing practical realities of frontier medicine. "There is something I want to ask you," the translation unit said. I turned around. "In the night," Harath said, or the unit rendered it as him saying, "you told me when the pain was coming. You told me to prepare." "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it. "Because you deserve to know," I said. "Because knowing what's coming, even if you can't stop it, gives you something. It gives you a way to meet it rather than just receive it. A patient who knows what's happening to them is, I looked for the word, participating. In their own care, that matters." The long pause of the translation unit working on that. "Then, among my people, that would be considered a right of the dying, not the hurt, the dying." "Among mine," I said, "it's a right of anyone." He looked at me for a long time. "Adra Voss," the translation unit said carefully, "Keth-Sor Field Clinic, night nurse." "That's me. I will remember this place." I told him I hoped what he remembered most was the drain site instructions and the follow-up care schedule, because the wing was going to need a long and disciplined recovery, and it was not something to be cavalier about. He made the sound again, the one the translation unit hadn't tried to render on the first morning, low and resonant and held, and this time I thought I understood it better. Not a word, an acknowledgement, the sound of something received. He was transferred on the third day, when the care unit determined he was stable enough to move. They had arranged transport, something I never entirely understood the mechanics of, because it arrived before dawn, and the logistics of moving something his size were considerable, and they were accomplished with a quiet efficiency that suggested this was not the first time the Velcon had evacuated a wounded king from a place he shouldn't have been. I was there when they prepared to move him. It was early, the dawn not yet properly started, the flat light of the Dorn flats still in the not quite black stage that preceded the first gold. Dr. Pell was there too, and Cuvari, which was unusual for Cuvari, who was not an early riser. None of us had arranged to be there together. We had simply all come. The treatment bay had been the shape of our nights for 3 days. It felt different with the floor mostly clear again. The care unit had packed their equipment onto the hover pallets. The imaging rig was already outside. the supply rack stowed. The cot benches were where they always were, the autoclave in its corner, the skylights showing the not quite black of early morning. The room was simply a room again, and I was aware of that in the way you are aware of the silence after a sound you have been hearing long enough to forget you were hearing it. 3 days had settled into me more than I expected. I looked at the floor where he had been. The material of the stretcher had left a faint impression in the dust. The clinic floor was always dusty despite Cuvari's best efforts. The Dorn Flats dust that found every gap. That was the texture of the air itself out here. I looked at that impression for a moment and then looked away. Hareth was on the stretcher again, the same one they had brought him in on, the 4-pole dark-paneled one. He was awake. When they lifted him, he turned his head and found me in the small group at the bay door. Adra Voss, the translation unit said. I raised my hand. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he said something that the translation unit rendered as a title again, not Kethra this time but a different compound longer, and the unit flagged it as approximate with the additional note that it was of a formal register. She who kept the fire company while it was going out, and found that it was not going out after all. I didn't know what to say to that. I said, don't skip the follow-up appointments. The thing in his face that I had been learning to read did the thing it did. Then they carried him out, and the bay door was open for a moment on the Dorn Flats morning, the dust catching the very earliest light, and then it closed. The one with the dense markings was the last of the escort to leave. He stopped at the bay door when the others had gone through. He looked at me. I told him that you did not ask what he was, the translation unit said. He said that is what made you worth answering. I said that I appreciated that. He looked at me for another moment. He will send something, the unit said. He asked me to tell you it is not payment. He said, a long pause, he said you will understand the difference. I said I probably would. He left. I went back inside and opened the next chart. There was a patient in the second cot bench, a human patient, a farm worker from the eastern settlement who had come in the previous afternoon with a badly infected hand from a wire fence, which was the kind of thing that happened to people out here, the kind of thing the clinic existed for. Dr. Pell had assessed him when he came in and started him on antibiotics and told him to rest and not use the hand. He had slept through all of the Velcon departure, which was either a commentary on how tired he had been or on how effective the antibiotics were, and he was awake now, sitting up on the cot bench looking at the empty space on the treatment bay floor with an expression I could not entirely parse. There was a dragon, he said. There was, I said. Big one. Very big. He thought about that for a moment. He all right. He's going to need some recovery time, I said, but yes, he's going to be all right. The farm worker nodded slowly, then he held up his infected hand. How's mine looking? I pulled on gloves and went to look at it. The swelling was down. The redness was retreating from the margins of the wound. The antibiotics were working. Better, I said, let me change the dressing. He held his hand out, and I got to work. The thing Hareth sent arrived 3 weeks later, on a supply convoy that looked ordinary until the driver handed me a package that was clearly not from the usual supply chain, wrapped differently, labeled in a script I didn't read, carried separately from the rest of the cargo. Inside was a small flat object, perhaps 15 centimeters across, made of something that was not quite metal and not quite stone. The surface of it worked into a pattern of interlocking scales in a color that was, there is no other way to say this, exactly the color of his scales, that deep bronze red with the darker edge line on each unit. The pattern was precise. It had been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had taken the time to do it right. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. I put it on the windowsill in my flat, the east-facing one, where the morning light came in. In the 20 minutes when the flat light went gold, it caught the color differently than at any other time of day. It went a deeper red, the bronze warming until the scale pattern seemed almost to breathe. I sat and watched the light change. I thought about 38 years. I thought about the things you learn to do and the things you learn to be and the difference between them, which is smaller than it sounds. I thought about the way a body tells you when the intervention is working, that specific settling, that slow release, that shift from struggle into steadiness. I thought about the sound of his breathing at 4 in the morning when the fluid was gone and he was sleeping the sleep of something that had turned a corner. I thought about what he had said. She who kept the fire company while it was going out and found that it was not going out after all. I thought about my husband briefly, the way I sometimes did in mornings. Not with grief, not anymore, just with the clear, simple fact of him. The weight of that years ago loss worn smooth now. A stone you carry long enough that you stop noticing the carrying. He would have liked the scale object on the windowsill. He would have wanted to know everything about the night. The light went from gold to white. I got my kit bag and went to work.